So yeah, the first section we're going to dive into. I'm just going to do a real quick, just a couple slides, a brief history of our U.S. educational system, just kind of give us a foundation of how it was started, and also how it's kind of been molded throughout different segregation movements to civil rights movements to colonization movements and things like that. Really like this quote: "The American educational system had us knowing the names of three boats Columbus came on better than the tribes whose land we lived on," and that for me is definitely true. I was definitely taught that, and I was never taught about the tribes who lived on the land I grew up on. All right, so the brief history of so this is a really simplistic history. So I could definitely we'll have resources towards the end if you want to dive deeper into this stuff. But I didn't want to spend too much time on this. Early, let's go back to early colonial history. We'll start at beginning of the 1600s. Colonial times. We have Jamestown. I think it was like 1607 or something like that. And then so we start a lot of colonial, mainly British colonial history, which is where our U.S. Educational systems kind of founded. That was our roots go back to that. At the same time, if you take our colonialism class, that Spain is colonizing much of the West and everything below the border and Florida, and then in France is colonizing a lot of the North and Canada, but we're just going to focus on British colonialism, starting in Virginia, essentially, but then expanding, throughout the different states. But the early colonial education, if there was education, which I would say the vast majority of people were not educated at that point, or were just basically given the basic education around their to understand their job, from farming to domestic work to things like that. But if there was education, it was almost always done at home. If kids were homeschooled, or if they had a few families that had wealth could hire private tutors, and then you also had apprenticeships. So you had guilds and things. So if you want so you would if you're training to be working leather working or metal smiths or something, you would receive additional education through your apprenticeships. But it was very basic. But I'd say the vast majority of people that learned maybe learn literacy and things like that were taught by the church. This and this was mainly happened in the North, where we have a lot of Puritan and Protestant religions that and their main goal was to teach basically to teach the Bible and to teach teach your religion to their students. So a lot of churches, that's where a lot of people learned how to actually, if you were the few people that did learn how to read and write, a lot of times that came from the church. So there really wasn't any kind of formal schooling or educational institutions around education. It was mainly just individual efforts. But we start seeing, around mid 1600s, we start seeing a few schools start to emerge. Like the first private school for white boys was in Manhattan. First, public school for white boys was in Boston in 1935. And then Harvard, the first college was founded in 1636. So we start seeing in the 1620s and 30s, we start seeing a few schools emerge, but not a whole lot. And these are mainly focused in the Northeast. And then we start seeing, so for the most part, for the next century or so, a lot of educations they're decentralized. If there was a school, it was because of the community rallied. They wanted the school and they wanted to finance the school. There was no like federal funding or state funding to help build a lot of these schools. I mean, some of these colleges, started with land grants, for the federal government, but it was once after the United States was established in the late 1700s. But for the most part, this was pretty hodgepodge. But then we start seeing this movement to kind of like centralize this, to kind of create public education. It really started. The first one was in 1647, Massachusetts Bay Colony. They decide that any town with 50 families it had to have an elementary school, and any town with 100 families had to have a Latin school. Again, this was to kind of teach kids about Puritan religion and Calvinistic religion and things like that. So it was very focused on religion. But it really wasn't until like the mid 1800s to early 1900s did after the colonial period, when the United States was formed, to local, state, and governments really start focusing on creating taxpayer-funded school systems. So we start seeing that emerge in around mid 1800s. That really blew up after the Civil War, particularly in the South. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And then it was really by 1918. The federal government basically required that all American children, in every state, had to, attend at least an elementary school. So there had to be an elementary school system for every child in the country. So by early 1900s, we start seeing this educational system that we do have now. But for the most part, throughout this period, the curriculum, wasn't that intense. It was basically, about teaching about, family values, particularly around patriarchy and things like that. About religion was a big focus, and just like community and how to kind of operate and manage communities and things, and how you fit into that. So it was more about, is essentially about creating community around there. And then they did teach some things like literacy and arithmetic, civic duty, morality, and specific trades and things like that. But but it was all, if they did dive into history, if they did dive into morality and things like that, it was all based on like a Greek European history. So any philosophy, literature, things like that, either came from historic Greek times, or it came from their modern European history. So we start seeing a lot of European American exceptionalism, how colonialism was bringing civilization to the world, manifest destiny, all these things that that Europeans were on the right side of God and things like that. So that's mainly what they're being taught throughout this time period. And at the other side, we start seeing, the effects for non-white people was a little bit different, particularly around colonial education. So the colonial education from the beginning, part of colonialism is a main part. It is about erasing indigenous culture and indigenous history. So it's about cultural genocide of indigenous schools, and that that happened from the get-go. Even when in the early 1600s, when indigenous people were enslaved by Europeans, I mean they were taught if they were taught, they were taught Eurocentric histories and cultures, and a lot of these early colonial times looked at Native Americans and indigenous people as being evil and inferior yeah. So and this really picked up in the mid 1800s. 1864, Congress makes it illegal for Native Americans to be taught in their native languages. 1870s, they start building these boarding schools. Some of the first ones were Carlisle boarding schools, where they essentially kidnap Native children and send them to these schools to be basically brainwashed into European culture, where they were punished for practicing their culture. It would be whipped and things if they spoke in their native language. The idea, Captain Richard H. Pratt, he's one of the founders of the Carlisle Institutes, and really founds this whole movement of native schools native boarding schools. He has this famous quote where he says, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So these schools were mainly targeted and focused on cultural genocide, about destroying the culture and the history of indigenous populations, and then immerging them into the European American, culture. So, and a simulation of them. And this was devastating. Over 150,000 Native children were kidnapped. I say kidnapped. They weren't, no one sent their kids to these schools. These kids were kidnapped. We talk a lot more about this on the colonialism class. If you want to learn more about this, we have some really great videos and about this as well. So that was happening on the indigenous side, and then on the the black side, for the most part, especially before the Civil War, it was really hard for Black people to get educated. Most Southern states actually had laws forbidding it, forbidding enslaved people to read. They were worried about that. I mean, that could help start rebellions and things like that if Black people were able to read. So there was laws in the South, and then even in the North, there was some schools, but it was still difficult for Black people to receive the education. But then after the Civil War, that really began to change during this period of Reconstruction, which we talked a lot about during the last class, the slavery class, the foundations to white supremacy class. Reconstruction was this amazing period, about a decade, of essentially trying to create an egalitarian society in the South. But ultimately, it was defeated by white supremacy, and white supremacy through voter suppression and terrorism kind of retook over the governments and basically ruled, for the next century. It was a white supremacist South. But during that brief, decade of Reconstruction, a lot of Black politicians got elected. A lot of great, what we call radical Republicans, which come pretty opposite of our modern Republicans. They were, Republicans that were fighting for civil rights legislation and equality and things like that. So a lot of them got elected in the South, and they did a lot of amazing work. There's a lot of, we'll talk a little bit more about it. There's this whole school, the Dunning School, that's tried to create this narrative that they were all corrupt and it did horrific things, but in reality, it was an amazing government, probably one of the better governments the South's ever had. And they passed and they did all kinds of great legislation. But one of the things that they did, the biggest one they're most known for, is they created the first Southern school systems. So they created a whole system of taxpayer-funded schools in the South for both Black and white children. And that was, before this, there wasn't really a taxpayer-funded schools. I mean, again, they were operating off some towns that wanted to fund schools, they funded them, and it was almost always for white children. But this was like the first educational system that was created in the South, and this was because of the Reconstruction government. And at the same time, we start seeing during this period, what we call historical Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, were created. And this was really important because at the time there was colleges around, but even after the Civil War, and after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and these new civil rights bills, colleges still, discriminated and did not accept Black people or not that many Black people. It was really hard for a Black person to get into these colleges. So then we start seeing this emergence of these new historically Black colleges and universities that were focused on providing higher education to Black people that were being shut out of white colleges. And the vast majority of them actually started in 1867 during the Reconstruction time period, and then we start seeing a lot of them built as well up until the 1900s. And that's where like Howard University was built in 1867. Morehouse, all these Alabama State. Some of these amazing schools that are still doing great work today. But at the time, so we see this after the Civil War ends and Reconstruction period. We start seeing more, schools and and colleges and things built for Black people to serve for Black people. But at the same time, these schools are very segregated, especially particularly after the Reconstruction is overthrown in I believe 1877. In white supremacy, basically the old Confederates just basically take over the South. And at that point, everything is and, they bring Jim Crow, and everything is essentially segregated. And that's not just in the South. We see, enormous amount of segregation, particularly in schools all over this country as well. But particularly in the South, we see Jim Crow rise. There's pretty harsh segregation. And then even our Supreme Court backs this up with Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld the legality of segregation. So, so a lot of people tried to fight to overturn that, segregation in the late 1800s, but the Supreme Court confirmed that. And remember that day, because we're going to talk more about, like Confederate statues. A lot of the first Confederate statues weren't built after the Civil War. They were built during time periods of civil, civil rights, movements and progresses. And this was a big time period where a lot of Confederate statues were built, as a way to intimidate Black people, trying to remove Jim Crow. But then eventually in 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education, and our next class is going to be completely on the history of racial segregation. So we're going to dive really deeply into a lot of this stuff in our next class. But in 1954, essentially the Supreme Court, new Supreme Court, decides that Plessy v. Ferguson's not okay anymore. So they get overturn that, and they basically ban segregation in schools, and ultimately which ultimately paves the way to ban Jim Crow throughout the country. So we start, right away. I mean, we start seeing the emergence of the Dixiecrat Party and this white resistance to segregation. So it really takes decades for many of these schools, particularly in the South, to start desegregating. But really by the 60s and late 60s, 70s and early 80s, we start seeing a lot of these schools really becoming desegregated. This is a graph that kind of shows the desegregation of white schools, and we really see particularly between 1970 and 1980s, we see a huge jump, and that's because there's a lot of legislation that and court decisions and things that happen that really force schools to start opening up. And busing happens, and things like that. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the next class. But then from the 80s to 90s, we have a combination of Nixon and Reagan Supreme Court judges start tearing down a lot of this these legislation and court cases pushing segregation, and we start seeing due to a lot of different court cases and different presidents and stuff, we start seeing there's not so much of a push anymore to just desegregate these schools, and then we start seeing from after the starting around 1990s, we start seeing a steady decline that's still going today, and we're at the point where we've actually returned to our pre-1968 levels. So our level of desegregation is the same as we see from 1968 at this point. Which 1968 was like the last civil rights bills. There was 64, 65, and 68. So we were, and that's how our trend is going right now. Even though overall our country is slowly desegregating, our schools are resegregating right now. And that's really important to understand, because it's not just about diversity. It's not just about, giving people opportunities and making a melting pot. This is about access to resources. There's a study that was done last year that said white schools receive $23 billion more than non-white schools. That's $733 more per student. And this is disproportionately speaking, that's $730 more per student. And I've seen studies as well that I mean, this is the low end. I've seen studies that go way beyond that, especially when you get onto like certain state level studies. So right now, I mean, we are pouring more funding into white schools as we our educational system is resegregating, creating more and more white schools as well. So this is a very disturbing trend as well. That we're seeing. And then some of the common themes that we're going to see. I mean, so a lot of these themes started from from the colonial days, but a lot of them. I mean, these are themes that you're still going to find today, and we're going to talk. We're going to dive deeper into a lot of these different themes throughout this class. But a big one is just the colonial narratives. You know, the racial, indigenous histories, and the impact of slavery on the rise of U.S. capitalism in our country as well. And we see this today. We just had Thanksgiving. Literally a holiday that is completely based on fiction and just completely whitewashes the reality of what the relationship was between early colonialists and indigenous populations and then races, the genocide that happened as well. So that so this is still a very popular narrative that happens. Most people couldn't tell you who the early tribes were that are living on the indigenous history of the land that they're living on right now. Most people don't understand that connection between our slavery and the fact that early U.S. slavery, our country was founded on not only our country but the Industrial Revolution, modern Europe. All of this was founded on slavery. Rise of capitalism was founded on slavery, and most people, we don't have that connection at all. And not only that, but genuinely people believe that colonialism, even though there was bad things that happened, it was a necessary evil, and it brought things like civilization across the world, which is a very disturbing narrative. But we talk a lot more about that in the colonial class if you want to learn more about that. We are still very Eurocentric. I mean, we have we have declined somewhat. We have introduced, we'll talk about in the 60s and 70s since, we've introduced, different narratives as well to our educational system, but we're still very Eurocentric. Our requirements are European history, Greek history, philosophy, all this stuff, while other histories are irrelevant, like Black history or African history, is our electives usually, if they're offered at all. We're going to talk a little bit about ethnic studies and particularly around Latinx history, and how that is a battle to teach, anything but, this Eurocentric is in many places it is a battle that's still raging today. So we are still very Eurocentric. We approach a lot of histories, what we call top-down histories as well, where we basically teach histories from the perspectives of elite. We teach history like our American Revolution is taught through the perspectives of the founding fathers, who were basically the colonial elites of our time, and we teach our history based on how they saw things and how it impacted them. And we do that, and then it could be it's inspiring. From them it was like this great, they're doing this new democracy that this experiment against tyranny and all that stuff, and it's very inspiring. And I can see why we want this as our founding story, but if you reverse that and do what we call bottom up, where we look at the people on the bottom of the social hierarchy at that time, indigenous people, enslaved people, women, and you look at their perspective on the history of this country, on the Declaration of Independence, we see a completely different narrative where we don't see so much the democracy. We see this we see this small group of elites creating this country for themselves. We see the slaveocracy, we see patriarchy, we see colonialism and things like that. So it's completely different which perspective you're looking at, and we typically teach our history through the white European elite perspective, which paints our history in a pretty good light. If we really want to understand the history, we need to look at all perspectives. And it's not about just choosing one perspective. It's about looking at every perspective and creating our own viewpoint from multiple perspectives. I mean, there is important things that come out of the colonial elite perspective, but if you're not teaching that along with the indigenous perspective and an enslaved perspective, it just becomes this form of propaganda. And then whitewashing, we're going to talk a lot more about whitewashing, but whitewashing is just glossing over, it's omitting, it's covering up the negative histories. And I think one of the biggest parts is what we do is omission. like I was saying, we will teach about, realities. Like we'll teach about FDRs and the New Deal. The New Deal was amazing. That really brought this country out of depression and did so many great things. But then we don't mention that it was only for white people, and it actually created redlining and created enormous, wealth gaps as well. So it's not like it's one or the other. The New Deal was both. It helped us out with depression and also created racial inequalities. So it's about teaching both of those sides. But if you just omit one of those things, again, it's propaganda. And then propaganda next. So we're going to talk a lot about the lost cause of Confederacy, the Dunning School, these institutions that basically created, that arose not, after the Civil War, but rose during periods like Plessy versus Ferguson and the 1960 Civil Rights Bill. So it rose during these movements of, towards racial progress, and they rose up to create these basically rewrite our history, and downplay slavery, downplay the atrocities of the South, during the antebellum South, as a way to connect it to almost continue white supremacy and intimidate Black people to this day. So we're going to dive really deeply into that, and we have a whole section on the lost cause of Confederacy. But that we still see the effects of that today. We still have a really hard time teaching slavery today, teaching the realities of slavery and connecting slavery to our present and how it's because there is a deep connection to the realities that we face today that go back to slavery that most of our schools don't teach at all. And then American exceptionalism, this idea that we are always on the right, God, morality. We hear this manifest destiny, where even if we did things wrong, we overcame them. If you did watch that John Oliver show, at the beginning, there was that dad is talking about he wants a positive history for his children, that that we overcame things like slavery, when in reality, like there are still legacies of slavery we have not overcame, and it wasn't we didn't overcame it. A small group of people fought and killed, lost their lives fighting other people, other Americans, who fought to preserve slavery. So that it's a tough one. Stephen Watt writes this really great article about American exceptionalism, but he writes, most great powers have considered themselves superior to their rivals and have believed that we're advancing some greater good when they impose their preferences on others. Among great powers, thinking special is a norm, not an exception. So this is something that a lot of oppressive governments have done. A lot of countries that do. This idea of like that we'll talk more about this, but this idea of progress, that we're even though we've done bad things in the past, we're always on this like path towards progress of overcoming things, making this country better. And the reality is that's in some ways that's true, and in a lot of ways that's not true, and we really need to get away from that thinking. And another thing that we talk about is, well, one thing that we don't talk about in our educational systems is white supremacy. And when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about a bunch of people in hoods. That's one form of white supremacy. I'm talking about these institutions, systems that basically benefit white people culturally, politically, economically, socially, at the expense of Black people. So we talked a lot about in our first class what white supremacy really is. And the problem with white supremacy, even though this has been a dominating factor, a dominating system in our world since probably like 1400s, we don't talk about it at all. So Robin DiAngelo writes, although white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it's never named. In this way, white supremacy is rendered invisible while other political systems, socialism, capitalism, fascism, are identified and studied. In fact, much of white supremacy's power is drawn from this invisibility, the taken for granted aspects that underwrite all of our political and social contracts. So I mean, I know I never heard the word white supremacy until probably in my 20s, I just, no one ever talked about it during my school, during my history classes, my social sciences, even though this, white supremacy really captures this idea of European colonialism, of creating race, as a way to divide the lower class, of like creating the idea of whiteness. The idea of white people, was created legally in the late 1600s by the colonial government of Virginia to essentially create a legal status for to privilege people of European descent over everyone else. And what white changed. Some people were qualified, like Jewish people and Irish people didn't get that. It had nothing to do with the color of your skin. It had to do with a social status. And certain people that had white skin, like Jews and Jewish people and Irish people, didn't qualify too much later. So, and all that history is just, we're not taught any of that. We're not taught about, how white people have been benefited, legally, and socially and economically, throughout this country. Or if we do, we're taught, and it's like compartmentalized, where we're talking about like redlining, but we don't talk about how redlining is a form of white supremacy and how it connects to everything. So we keep things invisible. And the last concept I want to talk about is presentism. Again, we're going to talk a lot about this stuff a little bit. We're going to get a little bit deeper, but Michael Harriot, a great writer, writes this. The idea that we shouldn't judge the actions of people in the past using modern day standards, as if white people of the past couldn't quite grasp the idea of inhumanity and brutality until 1861. And that's what, when we use this presentism to help enforce whitewashing, to downplay the realities of our country. And that's not just, it's not about being like, it's not about being critical or being negative. This is about understanding our current realities. Like, if we don't understand how, horrific the foundations of our country were, we're not going to understand the realities we're facing today, and we're definitely not going to understand how we're going to move forward and heal this country, and bring back economic justice and things like that. So yeah, again, we'll talk more about this, but we definitely don't look at our past with a very critical or eye. We more focus on Thomas Jefferson. They downplay the fact that he was a rapist, and he basically had a room connected to his bedroom where he kept a black woman, enslaved woman, who he raped and fathered many children and kept them enslaved, and I mean, her first child was at 14. And whether you want to judge him or not, you could say, oh, well, that's, everyone did that, and then reality is a lot of, there was an epidemic of rape. Rape was a huge factor in slavery. So, whether you want to judge him or not is one thing, but at the same time, you have to call him out. I mean, he was raping this woman. You can't just say that, oh, they had a relationship. That was, so a lot of times we use we fear this judgment. It's not about judging. It's about telling an accurate story. And then if you want to judge or not, it's up to you. But we at least need to tell the accuracy of what's happening. So these are a lot of themes that we see in our educational system, especially around our history curriculum that we teach.